Hello everyone, I am Sergio Maldonado and this is Masters of Privacy, a set of interviews covering the intersection of marketing, data, privacy and technology with a clear goal in mind, which is redefining the relationship between people, brands and media around transparency and control. Which is to say, we're aiming for real customer centricity, or if you will, human centricity. We regularly talk to DPOs, CMOs, CDOs, and whoever else we find interesting and able to share valuable insights. So we hope you like it. Please do reach out if you have any ideas on future topics or speakers. Okay, we have Alan Chapell here today, and he's outside Privacy and AI counsel for many AdTech and Mart Tech companies. He started his career in the digital space in 1997 at Jupiter Research and is now the principal analyst at the Chapell Report, which is a monthly report focusing on the intersection between privacy, competition, addressability, and AI in the digital media space. So pretty much in our sweet spot. Alan is board chair of the Network Advertising Initiative, the premier trade association for third-party ad tech marketplaces. And on top of that, you should listen to him sing and play the piano, and that's something I admire even more than his privacy and martech expertise. In fact, his band, Chapell, is about to release its 7th album, The Underground Music Show, and we'll add a link to his profile on Spotify. Let's get on with it. Alan, thanks for coming.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Why do you think the sandbox is not ready to replace third-party cookies, or why do you think the CMA in the UK believes that?
Sure, it's a great question. And I think you need to start the answer with an acknowledgement of what the Chrome team is trying to do here is really, really hard. And it's sort of ironic, but back in 2012, there was a W3C working group that was primarily focused on the creation of a do not track standard. And a very smart privacy advocate had proposed the creation of a browser-based ad serving mechanism that would be a lot more privacy safe. And the response from a number of the industry side, but it was really led by Google, which is kind of ironic because they gave a very thoughtful response that you could boil down to a client-side ad server does not scale and that it does not offer any discernible privacy benefit. And I think, for all the talk of, well, that was, well over a decade ago and technology has changed and we're much smarter about this stuff now. The reality is that Google has not been able to overcome either of those objections. And I say that, so when you ask me, back a year ago, it was pretty clear that those who were earnestly testing the Privacy Sandbox were finding a whole bunch of bugs. Some of those bugs were structural, like maybe it wasn't such a good idea for the browser team, who clearly wasn't consulting with the Google Ads team. Maybe it wasn't such a good idea for them to do this on their own because there are a whole bunch of intricacies about how the ad serving world works. There's problems around documentation because it's really difficult to use. I think that there are problems with the entire design because they've sort of restructured how ad serving works, and that was one of the complaints of the IAB. And for Google to come back and say, well, of course we had to restructure how things work. Well, fair enough, but at the end of the day, I think Google is drastically understating the level of complexity and costs involved, and then simultaneously overstating the value derived by the Privacy Sandbox tools, and those are really fundamental problems. Now, with respect to what the Competition and Markets Authority may or may not do, I'm certainly not inside their minds. I would say that they've been polite in response to industry feedback. It's not clear to me exactly whether or not they're going to stop this whole thing. I don't think they know whether or not they're going to right now. I'm of the view that it's just as likely that they hold their nose and allow this whole thing to go through than it is that they stop it. But I will be very pleased to be wrong about that. And I have people whose opinion I respect, feel like the CMA is, is ultimately gonna or is ultimately likely to force Google into making additional concessions, and what those look like and how I'm not exactly sure.
So you did write about that as well. So you said, what if Google were to sacrifice the ad server? So on the publisher side, I guess that's the ads manager, so GAM today, because he has a very big presence, so he will take a short-term hit. I guess he could also, extend that to other pieces, and they have less and less impact on the overall numbers. So now that we have an antitrust case as well running at the same time, do you see that?
Well, yeah. So I had speculated that Google might take its traditional ad tech stack, the network business, uh, built on, I guess, the DoubleClick acquisition, but a number of others. And I speculated that they might be willing to use that as the sacrificial lamb to a regulator to say, okay, well, we'll divest that part of our business. Um, and what's sort of interesting is that it seems more likely rather than less likely that something like that is going to happen. It's interesting that the network business is one of the few business units within Google that isn't growing. In fact, it's shrinking. And you're seeing, so you could certainly envision a scenario where, the current network business continues to shrink, they divest it, more and more ad revenue goes into their owned and operated properties. I don't think that's science fiction. I think that's probably, as likely as not, maybe more likely than not, that type of scenario plays out. So, with respect to the sandbox, one of the challenges has been, the CMA has sort of implied that the sandbox tools, well, they said it can't harm competition, but that's an open-ended characterization in some ways. I mean, it's certainly going to hurt competition a little bit, and I think it's really more about what is the acceptable threshold under which competition gets hurt, and we haven't really gotten an answer from that from either Google or from the CMA. So, is the Privacy Sandbox supposed to be half as good as third-party cookies? Is it supposed to be 80% as good as third-party cookies? Is it supposed to be 98.99? I don't know the answer to that, and nobody seems to be saying. Right now the testing that I've seen suggests a fair 30-40% drop off in terms of revenues, and that's just top line. And so that's to call that a problem would be an understatement.
Some people are very, very cynical and believe that by inviting so many stakeholders, like privacy activists and AdTech and the publishers, and all of these players trying to make a living on their legacy, technology, that it was clear that you couldn't please everyone at the same time, and that it was not going to end well, and so I don't know if this is all part of a plan. It doesn't look like it's part of a plan, but now looking at all of these pieces, right, I see people complaining about everything. Like over the years, we've seen flocks. Before we had Topics API, and we had privacy concerns about storing some of these things in the browser, keeping some interests tied to individual devices. With time, we've been adding more noise. So we've got these 5 topics where I don't know if it's 2 that now are just totally made up, right? When you look them up on your browser, and then we've got the other side. We've got all of the platforms, or even the other browsers. They've been, even though they're not in theory supporting the Privacy Sandbox, maybe Edge, Microsoft slightly for a few of these things, some of these APIs, but they've been adding to these measurement tools like private aggregation, or even in the protected audiences API, they've been adding to it. And the more you add to that, and you let people target, right, the more you are building a case for activists to say this is not safe. So we are facing a challenge that we never had to face when the AdTech stack was built with DoubleClick, for example, you were mentioning, right? Or with what the IAB has put together, because that debate never took place. So all of these people around the table at W3C, I never saw anywhere before, and now we do. Is there a way out?
Google has tried to hold this out as a collaboration across industry and a creation of a standard via a multi-stakeholder process. And I think that characterization is somewhat disingenuous. I think at best, what Google was offering, and this isn't a bad thing, but what Google was offering was limited industry input into an ad server that they were building, or an ad platform they were building within the Chrome browser. Now, why was Google trying to hold it out as an industry stakeholder process? I'm not sure. I think one reason was perhaps in contrast to Apple, who just sort of sticks their middle finger out at everybody and just builds something, and you just kind of have to deal with it. And maybe they were trying to contrast with Apple's approach. But on the other hand, Apple has a closed network. If you were surprised that Apple eventually got rid of the IDFA, or at least put it behind a very difficult consent standard, then I would politely submit you might not have been paying attention. It was Apple's operating system and Apple's platform that they allowed an ID to be created. So contrast to that to what Google's doing, where they're effectively building a moat around the open internet. And so I think they sort of had to create this in a way where they're trying to have it both ways. What they are trying not to say is that they're creating an ad platform that will be the gateway to the open internet, because once you do that, once you make that admission, then suddenly it stops becoming a concern for competition enforcers, and it becomes a wait, no friggin' way from competition.
Yeah. I want to leave behind competition now, but just as a last thought, Apple. So the fact is that Google are making it clear that they believe that the internet cannot sustain itself unless there are ad-supported businesses. They're very clear about that. Whereas other browsers, we've had Brave here on the program, talking about their own approach to ads. And it's very hard to cut through the market. Agencies, advertisers don't believe in that, in this new system, because they have their metrics and they've been used to some levels of performance and attribution. So it's very hard to implement something entirely new. But if they were to, again, finally lose that conflict of interest and do like Apple, and so Apple has imposed, as you said, a very defective SDK ad network at first, right? It's been going on for like 6 years now, and now it's much better. But only the large platforms with good signals and maybe lots of first-party data can then leverage, in a more sophisticated way, the privacy-preserving signals in the SDK ad network. So it seems like at the same time it's been favoring, even though it seemed like it was hurting Meta at the outset, it's been favoring those that have the muscle to do things that are harder, that require more advanced, privacy engineering and so on. So at least it seems like everything is going that direction, with media mix modeling and more advanced attribution, more sophisticated systems where both publishers, which are never going to have the muscle because they live day to day, right, and small advertisers are going to struggle. So whatever we do, in the end, is going to, however we look at it, is going to have an impact on competition, even if Google stays out of it. But I don't know, it's just a wild thought. Do you have any ideas about how that could play out?
Yeah, I'm particularly concerned that we're transitioning from a certainly flawed but a marketplace built on some level of data interoperability, and we're transitioning to a walled gardens, big and small. And one of the challenges with the walled garden as a concept is that you kind of have to trust the walled garden. You got to trust their numbers. And so just from a measuring the efficacy of your ad spend perspective, that's a problem because publicly traded companies are going to paint the best version of their ad results, and if there's no third party that's able to really go in there and rate the efficacy of the media spend, that's just not really a great sign for the health of the market. With respect to content creators, we've seen how many different examples of studies, based on, once COPPA got into place, and then the FTC enforced against YouTube, and you saw the amount of revenue that a kid's content creator can make. And I'm not here to say that people should be creating profiles on kids, but I am saying that it's also a bad outcome if there's significantly less content available to people because of some of the privacy decisions being made. And for all due respect to my friends in Europe who think that contextual advertising is somehow going to save the newspaper industry, it's just news is the exact type of content that contextual really doesn't work very well for in many cases.
So now, since you mentioned Europe, right, let me bring it into the privacy space, right, our favorite area. So now, let's look at the privacy implications. So in the end, Google is saying that since everybody has already got rid of third-party cookies and they were bad for privacy, that it's high time for them to do the same. In their case, again, while preserving the ad-supported internet. So, Topics API. Google is saying, or the Privacy Sandbox team are saying, that Topics API, again, those interests that are being collected through your browsing, right? That those are going to be opt-in in Europe, and they're going to be opt-out in the US. In Europe, we've got a problem, as you know very well, right? We've had a few interviews here on these things, and we've got these crazy, or this stone in our shoe, to put it like that, which is the ePrivacy, right? This problem where it's not even technology neutral, where the CNIL, so the French supervisory authority, they've said already that Topics API will require consent because it falls within this idea of writing to or reading from the device. And we've had an interview here, and I'm getting to the question, with Peter Craddock.
Yeah.
Specifically on consent or pay, but it's very related, of course, as we'll see now, where he was advocating for a review of ePrivacy, since we're not able to revisit it with a new regulation and all of these issues we've had, at least understand that the way certain building blocks work in the browser, in AdTech, it is really necessary for a website to function. In this case, informing through interests the potential for advertising. So that if we were to carve out something like that, to consider a Topics API, or the fact that we are reading some interests, where there's much more control and there's no unique pseudonymized identifier, if we were to finally get rid of ePrivacy and we could be fully facing the GDPR alone, then we would be right in a different discussion. So what do you think? Now, imagine that we were able to do as Peter Craddock was suggesting, right? Let's dream. That, the CNIL and everyone at the ADPB were to say, look, so we're not able to fix ePrivacy, it's a big mess. Then, also, last thing I'll say is that the worst pain with ePrivacy is that it simply compels you to do the worst possible thing, because you need to ask for consent no matter what. So then why stop at topics? Let's just go all the way to encrypted, to hashed emails, and why not just do whatever, the trade desk is offering. So there's no different levels if everything needs consent. So assuming that that was not the case, and maybe you have some thoughts about that too, but then do you really believe that that topics would be more privacy preserving than third-party cookies? What's your view on that?
Oh, it potentially topics would certainly conceptually be more privacy preserving. I agree with your with the level of frustration around the Europe regulatory framework, which seems to think that a consent for any is required for contextual. It's required for anything, and I believe, and I'm not here to try to scold how we certainly have our flaws in the U.S. So I'm not here to cast dispersions around the EU regulatory framework. But one of the goals of a regulator would be to try to create some incentives for the marketplace to act responsibly. And here, by requiring a consent for everything because they find targeted advertising so distasteful, they're actually not helping the marketplace regulate. They're actually hurting it. And I don't think that point gets made directly enough, often enough. But to answer your question, and this is a really good discussion as well. Like at a high level, the idea of looking to create privacy enhancing technologies and techniques in an advertising context is a laudable goal, and I want to separate Google's attempt at creating PETs, which I think is an absolutely wonderful goal, with Google's penchant for preferencing itself while it does just about everything, which is not a laudable goal. And I think Google tends to conflate those two things, where it's sort of like, if you don't like the sandbox, then you obviously don't like privacy. And I think that's sort of a preposterous notion, but that they try to imply throughout the market. So at a high level, topics is certainly more privacy protective than the current status quo. The challenge with topics, though, is that it's somewhat helpful for certain publishers. It's not helpful at all to other publishers, and so those publishers to whom it doesn't work for will either not contribute to topics, will need to find other targeting techniques, and then we're sort of back to square one.
Yeah. So something we've heard complaints. First, we had these complaints about. So if you were a very niche publication, then you know very well your audience, like it's a publication about golf or surf or whatever, and you're contributing more than you're getting because you contribute a very specific interest to a very generic publication that would benefit from your ability, right, to collect that interest. And there was that concern. And then there's been something that you mentioned as well, I believe in one of your articles at some point, which is latency, right?
Yeah,
latency.
that's a huge
If you process everything, right, you were right about that. If you process things on the browser, then things take much longer, and that has an impact on the publisher's ability to even, show up in the rankings or for SEO. And I think you were right about this thing, right?
Yeah.
And then there's that element. There's the answer that Google gave to that latency problem. So now they're proposing trusted execution environment, so confidential computing, which we've been reviewing on this in the podcast as well. But they were imposing either the Google Cloud Platform, so fitting all of the all of the babies around, either the Google Cloud Platform, or now it's been opened up to AWS. But for example, Azure is not compatible with the Privacy Sandbox. So if you want it to have less, latency, then you need to now accept that the local processing has to be combined with confidential computing, but on the Google Cloud. And the CMA has pointed that out. So there's so many little issues here. Again, I really feel like at some point someone has to think, let's sacrifice this baby and focus on our walled garden, which indeed is going to prosper because it seems like everything else is falling. And then we have a proper privacy debate, which I really want to have, which is what you were saying. If contextual doesn't really work because we're not in the world of mass media and it's only going to work for like Procter & Gamble, and the more you push contextual, the more you're going to hurt the small direct-to-consumer or e-commerce players, then how do we build something that is sustainable And do you have any ideas around that, or I'm rambling?
Well, no, I think you're making some really good points. And the one that really jumps out to me is, uh, and because this happens with Google a lot over the last decade, there's a Google created problem for publishers. And then the solution inevitably is more reliance on Google. And that happens repeatedly. I guess here it's a little less bad because you're at least given the option of running via AWS, but you're further restricting your ability to operate as an independent entity here, and that's probably not what publishers need. I mean, they need helpful tools, but what they don't need is things that increase the reliance on the large market makers, because that's really where they've struggled in terms of their bottom line over the last decade.
Um, how do you see that in the context of the US, maybe CCPA or any other state privacy laws, Colorado, Virginia, Topics API, or Privacy Sandbox? Is there anything that is sort of sounding the alarms when it comes to US compliance with regards to the Privacy Sandbox?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't think so. So I think that the US, unlike Europe, doesn't have a variant of the ePrivacy directive, and the US, for the most part, is a notice and opt out world. Now, the US is starting to create some exceptions to that. We're now treating ethnicity and religion as sensitive and requiring a consent. There's a hyper focus on health related data, certainly with Washington and the Federal Trade Commission. Um, but the really interesting one, which might impact what the Privacy Sandbox is doing, certainly topics, is that the collection of browsing data collected across multiple non affiliated segments, is increasingly being viewed as sensitive. I was at the NEI summit just yesterday, and a representative from the FTC has basically said, oh, yes, browser data is absolutely sensitive, and we've been taking that position for years now, which I think was a surprise to the audience. I think they can point to the Avast decision, but that was TrackWare, which is a little different than ad serving data. And they can point to Visio, but it's also closer to TrackWare because it's sort of web-wide data collection. But for better or worse, the FTC is now saying that browser data is sensitive, and that sentiment is codified in the federal draft of the privacy law under discussion. And it is also in the new law prohibiting the sale of data to foreign adversaries. Data collected across multiple digital properties is also in there. And so, you can write off one data point, maybe two, but there's now a number of data points that suggest that, the conceptually interest-based advertising is going to be viewed very differently in the US than it has been, and could arguably be subject to a consent standard and perhaps even a prohibition.
Yeah, because a universal opt-out, as in California or Colorado, if you were to apply to topics, in the end, that's already what Google has already said they're going to enforce. But I don't see how for example, the global privacy control, since you mentioned do not track at the outset, sort of this new do not track. I don't see the global privacy control signal affecting topics. I guess it only affects cookies, but I have no idea.
It's a great question. I would say certainly the conservative view would be, if a global privacy control was turned on, that the entirety of the sandbox processing activities would have to stop, or at least I don't want to say that's probably too broad, but most of them would have to stop. I would think, but I haven't really reviewed that. And I think that would be unfortunate. And I'm certainly not a fan of the sandbox, but if you're going to take the time to create something that is more privacy safe, it would seem like the incentive for doing so would make it not subject to opt out. Similarly to, you can't opt out of frequency capping.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. Yeah. Alan, thank you very much.
Oh, Sergio, thank you so much for having me. I had a wonderful time.
Thank you. Okay, that's all for today. Please follow the Masters of Privacy channel on LinkedIn if you want to find some interview transcripts, cheat sheets, and other useful resources and surprises every now and then. On top of that, episode notes and other feeds are available on mastersofprivacy.com. Thank you for listening.